Monterrey, 1846. American troops advance, expecting an easy victory. But nothing goes as planned. Instead, they walk straight into a storm of fire. In our previous episode, we saw how the Mexican army under General Ampudia finalized the fortifications in Monterrey, turning the city into a defensive stronghold. We also learned how, on September 19, 1846, the U.S. Army launched several scouting missions to uncover and assess the city defenses. Those dangerous missions revealed something critical. The city's western defenses had weak points. Based on that information, General Zachary and his officers made a bold decision to cut off the Mexican army by taking control of the Saltillo Road. To carry out his plan, General William Ward's 2nd Division marched west on September 20th. After brief but intense skirmishes with Mexican forces near Independence Hill, Ward's troops camped nearby, preparing for a decisive strike the next day. Meanwhile, back at Walnut Springs, Taylor was setting his own plan in motion. His troops quietly prepared to launch a diversion on the eastern side of Monterrey, designed to draw Mexican attention away from Ward's advancing forces in the west. The trap was set. The Americans were ready to launch a coordinated strike from both ends of the city, expecting a swift victory. But General Taylor was about to face a harsh surprise. In this episode, we will follow the opening moves of that coordinated assault, beginning with Taylor's diversion on the Eastern Front. We will see how the 1st Division advanced into a storm of Mexican fire, how hidden fortifications turned the battlefield into a nightmare, and how Monterrey's narrow streets transformed the fight into a brutal urban combat. What was meant to be a swift victory would soon become one of the bloodiest and most chaotic days of the entire war. On the night of September 20th, at Walnut Springs, Taylor's troops quietly prepared for battle. Taylor wasn't just planning an assault. He was already setting it in motion. Under the cover of darkness, he ordered the deployment of the only heavy artillery at his disposal. In the morning of September 21st, a 10-inch mortar and 2-pounder howitzers had been positioned roughly 1,300 meters or 1,400 yards from the Black Fort, concealed in a shallow depression in the terrain. At first light, as the horizon began to glow, the American artillery opened fire. Mortars thundered, hurling shells toward the citadel, also known as the Black Fort. Yet the fortress held. Despite hours of bombardment, the Mexican defenses remained unshaken. Meanwhile, Taylor had set his attack plan in motion. At 8 a.m., Taylor deployed elements of the 1st Division on the open plain. The force included the 1st and 3rd Infantry Regiments, along with volunteers from the Maryland and the District of Columbia. At that point, Taylor had not yet received Ward's request to create a diversion. The message would arrive an hour later at 9 a.m. By then, Taylor had already initiated the maneuver. Unknowingly, both generals had devised the same plan. A notable absence that morning was General Twiggs. The 1st Division's commander was too ill to lead his men. Without hesitation, Taylor handed command of the 1st Division to Colonel John Garland, issuing a firm directive: mount a strong demonstration against the city's eastern defenses, and if feasible, seize the enemy's position, but above all, avoid heavy casualties. From their post in the eastern fortifications, the Mexican defenders watched nervously as the American formations advanced. Ampudia's troops had spent the night fortifying their positions, and now, with no time to rest, they faced the most disciplined army the United States had ever sent to battle. General Francisco Mejia, one of the top Mexican generals, quickly grasped the situation. He approached Colonel Carrasco, commander of Fort Teneria, and warned him. The Americans would feint toward the citadel, but their true objective was Fort Teneria. Carrasco understood the implication. His 200 men, drawn from the 2nd Light Infantry Regiment and the Querétaro Battalion, braced for the coming assault. Their artillery, consisting of a 4-pounder, an 8-pounder, and a small howitzer, stood ready to fire on the advancing American troops of the 1st Division. As Garland's men moved across the plain, he formed his troops into columns, and then all hell broke loose. They had barely taken 100 steps when the citadel's artillery erupted. The Mexican cannons roared to life, filling the air with smoke and shrapnel. Explosions ripped through the advancing American columns, forcing the men to dive for cover in cornfields and shallow depressions. What Garland and his men didn't know was that some of the cannons firing on them may have been manned by former American soldiers. Months earlier, John Riley, an Irishman, and a group of foreign-born troops had deserted the U.S. Army and joined the Mexican side. They called themselves the San Patricios, or the St. Patrick's Battalion. Made up largely of Irish immigrants, they had switched allegiances after enduring discrimination within the American ranks. The Battle of Monterrey marked their first major engagement, and now these former comrades were raining destruction down upon the very army they once served. As Garland's men pressed forward, they were forced to leave the relative cover of the cornfields. That was when their true ordeal began. The artillerymen at Fort Teneria now had a clear line of sight on the advancing Americans and unleashed a storm of fire. At the same time, cannons from the Purisima Bridge, about 300 meters or 330 yards west of Teneria, opened fire in support. Then came a new threat. Additional cannon fire erupted from an unknown location. Garland and his men had just uncovered a deadly surprise. Fort Diablo, or Devil's Corner, located 270 meters or 300 yards southwest of Teneria. It was manned by 200 Mexican soldiers and 2 well-positioned cannons. Despite numerous reconnaissance missions and prisoner interrogations, the Americans had no idea this fort even existed. They were now discovering it in the worst possible way. Amid their relentless barrage, the American formations held their discipline, but it was clear they needed cover, and fast. Garland searched the battlefield for Major Mansfield, urgently needing guidance. He finally found him. Mansfield pointed to a new route, a right turn that led to a road roughly 200 meters or 220 yards from Fort Teneria. Garland immediately issued new orders. His division pivoted right, attempting to escape the deadly fire powering down on them. If they could reach the location Mansfield had indicated, they would find shelter behind Monterrey's stone buildings, an ideal position from which to flank Fort Teneria and strike from the rear. But changing direction under relentless artillery fire was no easy task. For the seasoned regulars of the U.S. Army, it became a test of sheer discipline. They gritted their teeth, tightened ranks, and maneuvered with remarkable precision. But for the Baltimore volunteers, it was too much to bear. Under the unrelenting Mexican bombardment, their lines collapsed. Men scattered into ditches and behind rocks, desperate to escape the carnage. Some fled all the way back to Walnut Springs. As the battle raged on, the remaining men of the 1st Division followed Major Mansfield. cautiously advancing toward the main north-south road that crossed the Santa Lucia Creek and led into Monterrey. But a new obstacle awaited them. Mexican forces had entrenched behind the creek, turning it into a natural defensive line, separating the northern plains from Monterrey. It was a perfect killing zone, and the Americans were walking straight into it. At that critical moment, as Garland's men neared Fort Teneria, fresh Mexican reinforcements arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Joaquin Castro arrived at Fort Teneria with 150 soldiers from the 3rd Light Infantry Regiment and an 8-pounder cannon to reinforce the garrison. As the Americans pushed into Monterrey's suburbs, musket fire tore through their ranks. Ampudia's troops, entrenched on rooftops overlooking the streets, unleashed a deadly crossfire on the tightly packed American columns. Garland would later recall in his report,
"We soon found ourselves in narrow streets, where we received a most destructive fire from 3 directions.
The 1st U.S. Infantry Regiment troops, pinned on the northern bank of the Santa Lucia Creek, watched helplessly as the slaughter unfolded. It was then that Captain Backus, whose name was as distinctive as his boldness, took matters into his own hands. With just 2 companies, roughly 44 men, he advanced east toward Fort Teneria, but they didn't go unnoticed. Mexican soldiers stationed in a nearby building spotted Backus' men and opened fire. Rather than fall back, Backus saw an opportunity. Backus concluded that if the building was so fiercely defended, it had to be important. With his small force, he launched an assault, stormed the building, and drove out the Mexican defenders. Now, in possession of this building, Backus climbed to the top, and from this elevated position, Backus could see the entire battlefield northeast of Monterrey, and immediately understood why the Mexicans were fighting so fiercely to hold it. He noticed that just 30 meters behind Fort Teneria stood a building known as La Destilería, or the Distillery. Its rooftop, crowded with Mexican troops, was critical to defending the fort's rear. Backus also confirmed that Fort Teneria was vulnerable from the west. The Mexicans had heavily fortified the north and east sides, expecting an attack from those directions, but the western flank remained exposed. While Backus' men held their position west of Teneria, the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment attempted to breach Monterrey's outer defenses. But the city's narrow streets made conventional tactics impossible. There was no room to form lines, no space to fire organized volleys, and no margin to maneuver. This wasn't the open battlefield they had trained for. This was urban warfare, brutal, chaotic, and unrelenting. Garland's men broke into small groups and pushed deeper into the city. As they advanced, Mexican fire intensified, and the 3rd Infantry paid a heavy price. Colonel Lear was struck in the face by a musket ball, a mortal wound. As he fell, the men around him surged forward, only to suffer further losses in the deadly labyrinth of Monterrey streets. Amid the chaos, Major Joseph Mansfield moved with steady resolve across the battlefield, calmly pointing out targets and urging his men onward. He briefly conferred with Captain Backus before setting off to find Colonel Garland. But before he could reach him, a musket ball tore into his leg. But Mansfield did not stop. Covering the wound with a handkerchief, he pressed on, determined to keep the assault alive. Meanwhile, on the plain north of Monterrey, Lieutenant Colonel William Watson faced a challenge of a different kind. The Baltimore and District of Columbia Battalion, composed of volunteers untested in battle, had taken cover behind bushes and shallow ditches. Unwilling to advance, they hesitated, but Watson was determined not to let them remain idle.
Now's the time, boys. Follow me.
Some of his men urged him to fall back, but he refused.
Never, boys. Never will I yield an inch. I have too much Irish blood in me to give up.
Seeking to break the stalemate, Watson galloped to Colonel Wilson and requested orders. The answer was brief and clear: attack Fort Teneria. Without hesitation, Watson gathered as many men as he could and led a charge toward the fort. But before he could even reach the walls, a Mexican sniper took aim. The bullet struck his horse, throwing Watson to the ground. Undeterred, he rose, rallied more men, and pressed forward. Moments later, as he neared the Teneria fort, a musket ball struck him in the neck. Watson collapsed, killed instantly. Leaderless and stunned, his men halted. Then, under devastating fire, they scattered, seeking cover wherever they could. The Baltimore Battalion's charge had failed. As the battle dragged on longer than expected, General Taylor ordered Braxton Bragg's 3rd Artillery Company to reinforce the attack. Bragg's battery had no time to lose. With 24 horses and 4 cannons, they sped across the open plain, rushing to support the troops in combat. Then the Mexican force fired upon them all at the same time, knowing that a single direct hit could shatter the charge. Bragg reached the outskirts of the city without suffering losses. Then Colonel Garland unwisely directed him into a narrow street. It was a street full of Mexican troops, where an enemy cannon was strategically placed behind a masonry barricade. Bragg ordered his cannons to be deployed, all of this under intense fire. Bragg's men were ready to tear apart the Mexican defenders. Then they realized something. There was only space for one artillery piece on the narrow, winding streets of Monterrey. The light artillery, so effective in open field battles, was now trapped by Monterrey's dense urban layout. Mexican soldiers fired from rooftops and windows, neutralizing Bragg's men. Meanwhile, the Mexican cannon, safely behind its barricade, kept up a relentless bombardment. Observing the desperate situation, Garland ordered Bragg to withdraw. The American artillerymen moved out of Monterrey's suburbs, battered but alive. 14 of their horses lay dead, and several men were wounded. The American artillery had made no difference. Monterrey was proving to be a very different kind of battlefield, one of which the Americans were not prepared for. Major Joseph Mansfield assessed the situation, and it didn't look promising. Too much blood had been spilled already that morning, and the 1st American Division wasn't close to capturing Fort Teneria or break into Monterrey. Mansfield approached Colonel Garland with a grim recommendation. "It is time to retreat." Garland agreed. The order was given, and the Americans began to withdraw. Inside Fort Teneria, the exhausted Mexican defenders could hardly believe what they were seeing. From the Mexican point of view, the Americans had been relentless, advancing steadily despite devastating fire. But now, as the 1st American Division faded into the distance, Mexican trumpets sounded the tune of victory. The men in Fort Teneria erupted in cheers. They had just repelled one of the best trained infantry divisions in the world. In the woods near Walnut Springs, General Zachary watched as victory slipped from his grasp. His regular troops had failed to capture Fort Teneria. At that moment, the American general knew he needed a new strategy. In our next episode, we will uncover what happened next. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and activate the bell so you don't miss any future content. I would love to read your comments. Don't hesitate to share them. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.